Expressions and filters. Hello everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, we want to take a look at a couple of the really powerful HTML templating features that Angular offers, expressions and filters. Now expressions we've worked with a lot. Those are just the things that let us extend the HTML document to include our Angular code, embed our Angular code right inside of the HTML. Then we'll take a look at how Angular lets us control and format those expressions with filters. We'll talk about what filters are in Angular, and we'll take a look at some of the built-in filters that Angular offers and how those work, including the localization options. Lastly, we want to take a look at the custom filters that we as developers can build ourselves. Custom filters are where we start getting into AngularJS and learning about its extensibility, learning about the things in Angular that we can expand upon to suit our own needs and build our own web applications, so that we can use the principles of AngularJS even while developing our own cool, complex web applications. Let's get started. If you're wondering what expressions are, well, quite simply, expressions are those double curly brace statements that we've been making inside of our HTML. Every time we want to display model data on the screen, we've been using an expression to do so. It's a way to extend or expand HTML so that we can declaratively display our data on the screen. But that's not all. Inside of an expression, AngularJS is actually interpreting a form of Angular script. So take something like this little code sample I've got up on screen. 1 plus 2 is not a reference to a model. I'm not displaying data on the screen. I'm actually executing a JavaScript command, 1 plus 2, and the output of this is going to be 1 plus 2 equals 3. It's roughly analogous to the JavaScript eval statement. An eval takes a string, if you don't know, and processes that string as if it were a JavaScript statement. Instead, Angular takes what's inside those curly braces and processes it like it's a command. Let me very quickly show you what I mean. I've got up on screen here a real simple fiddle. And this fiddle has the same statement twice in a row. 1 plus 2 equals expression 1 plus 2. Now I've done it twice to demonstrate that the first time, while it's inside of the ng app div, it evaluates 1 plus 2, while the second time, in the div that's not part of the application, it just prints out 1 plus 2 with the curly braces, the way you might expect. So ng-app, the Angular application, actually performs the math statement. It executes that command inside of the curly braces. The curly braces say, hey Angular, this is an expression, evaluate it, don't just print it out. Whereas in HTML, it would simply get printed out on screen. Now, that's not to say that expressions are JavaScript statements. There's a few real key differences that we ought to highlight. For starters, there are no controls or no conditionals inside of an expression allowed. So you can't use an if statement or you can't use a loop inside of an Angular expression. Those are JavaScript commands. Those are reserved for being used inside of your services, inside of your modules, inside of your controllers, the JavaScript code. Angular expressions are also what they call forgiving. And what they mean by forgiving is that undefined statements inside of an Angular expression evaluate to null. So in JavaScript, typically an undefined object, or if you try to reference a property on an object that doesn't exist, it's going to raise an error. It's going to cause an error in your browser. You get that little exclamation point down on the bottom. Well, you're not going to get that with an Angular expression that evaluates to null. And that's because it's probably more appropriate in an Angular statement to simply display blank or display nothing on the screen when you try to reference something that's undefined. As the Angular documentation itself carefully points out, maybe it's undefined because you're still waiting for an asynchronous callback to return the value that's going to define it. Either way, you don't want to raise an error, you don't want to cause an exception inside of your HTML code just because something hasn't been populated with data yet. Angular is forgiving in this sense. Angular expressions also operate inside of a context. Here's what we mean by that. The eval statement runs in the global context. It has access to the top global level JavaScript objects inside of your browser. If it wants to get a hold of the browser window, for instance, it can reference the window object. Not so with Angular expressions. Angular expressions operate inside of the scope object. Specifically, the scope object that was created in the DOM element where that expression exists. So you got to look at the parent of the expression to see what scope object it has access to. If it's inside of a controller, it has access to that controller's scope. If it's part of an ng repeat statement, then it has access to that specific instance of the ng repeat scope that's been made on the row that it's running. This is important to keep in mind because it means that the location in the DOM of your expression affects what it can have access to, affects what it can see, and how it might have to declare its variables in order to spit out the value or get access to the value that you're hoping for it to see. Let's take a quick look at this in action. On this fiddle here, I've got a controller, sample controller, and inside of that controller is a table with an ng-repeat on each row in the table. Now up here in my sample controller, you can see that I've declared a variable scope.greeting and set it equal to sample CTRL. Down here in my row controller, I've got the same variable, scope.greeting, but it's set equal to row CTRL. So here's what happens when I reference it. First, when I reference just the greeting variable explicitly inside of the row controller, I'm on the ng-repeat object, I get row CTRL. I'm getting the greeting right out of my local row controller. Conversely, I can refer to the parent object and get its greeting, and that's equal to sample CTRL. I've looked up one level in the scope hierarchy, and I've gotten the value out of that version of greeting. So these expressions exist within the context of the scope that they belong to. Their location in the document object model matters. It's a very important concept. The last big difference between Angular expressions and JavaScript expressions is that Angular expressions have access to filters, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Filters give us the ability to control, format, and yes, filter the data that we are displaying with our Angular expressions. Filters in AngularJS are probably best thought of as functions that can be applied directly to your expressions inside of the expression statement itself. And the way you do that is with the straight up and down bar, the single bar character, followed by your filter name, which goes immediately afterwards. And all that does is that tells the expression, that tells Angular to apply this filter to the expression that you just typed in. It looks like this. So here I'm using a filter called the currency filter, and all it's doing is it's applying the currency filter to the expression 1 plus 2. The output of this is going to be $3 with the dollar sign and the period in the 2 decimal places. The filter, in this case currency, is applying itself to the expression. Now, filters are very powerful. Like I mentioned, they're functions that you apply to your expression. So as functions, they can take parameters, and they take parameters with the colon symbol. You can see it right there in this example. Here, I've got 1 plus 2, and then I'm applying the currency filter, but I'm passing in the yen. It's a little bit small, but I'm passing in the yen symbol as my currency symbol. That's the first argument to the currency filter. So what gets printed out here instead of the dollar sign is the yen symbol, 3.00. I can put anything I want there. That's a parameter that the currency filter takes and uses when it applies its filter to the expression. Now there are a whole host of filters built into AngularJS, filter functions that AngularJS provides inside of the library itself. And those are all documented, those are detailed in the API. I recommend bookmarking this URL, keeping it handy when you want to work with these filters. It's a great reference tool. But let's take a few minutes to go through some of the cooler or more common functions, more common filters that you might find yourself using when working with AngularJS. These first two, number and currency, are filters that apply to numeric values. So let's talk about those a little bit, see them in action. I've got my fiddle up on screen now, and you can see I've got a couple of controllers, a number and a currency controller, just demonstrating how these two filters are applied. So right up here in the number controller, you can see that 1 plus 2, when I apply the filter number, doesn't do anything at all. It just calls it the number 3. So it's using the default number settings to figure out how many decimal places it should show. And you can see that in action on the second example, where I have a couple of long, drawn-out numbers with many decimal places. When I add those together and simply format them as a number, we get 3 decimal places. Why 3 decimal places? Well, that's the default locale rounding. So when you're working with number filters, you want to make sure that you apply your parameter, your first parameter to the number filter. Actually, the only parameter that it takes is a number that tells it how many decimal places to round off to. And that's what gets you the numbers formatted the way that you want them to be formatted. So you want to be explicit there when you're using the number filter. Pretty cool, right? Below that, in the currency controller, I'm doing kind of the same thing. I've just got a couple of examples of how you use the currency filter. If I just use it straight, 1 plus 2, formatted as a currency, I get $3. And that's because it's picking up the locale from my current machine. Currency, by default, is location specific. So if my locale were in a different locale, if I were in Europe, that would come up as euros. If I were in Britain, it might come up as pounds. And that's important to know because you can specify what you want the prefix to be, and that's what's going to show up on your numbers. And this is really important because if I'm showing, say, $3.61 in US dollars, but the person's location overrides it to yen. Well, 3.61 yen is not the same as 3.61 US dollars. Those are actually very different. There's no currency conversion going on. It's just the formatting of the display. So a lot of times with your currency filter, you want to be explicit in defining your currency values and make sure that you tell it to display as 3.61 US dollars so that the current locale doesn't override what that value is. Angular has a couple of filters that apply directly to string values, and actually limit to itself applies both to strings as well as to arrays. We'll take a look at that as well. So let's see that in action. In this fiddle, I'm showing off the lowercase and uppercase filters in the case controller, and those are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. They take the name Ben, which is mixed case, and they either show it as lowercase or uppercase. And there's not really any parameters or any filters. That's simply a way to force your string to be all uppercase or all lowercase. Kind of straightforward. Below that, we're taking a look at the limit to filter. And the limit to filter does take a parameter. You absolutely need it, because the limit to limits the number of characters in your string. So down here, my person.name is equal to Alexander. When I limit that to 5, I just get the first 5 characters. Notice that when I limit it to 50 over here, Alexander is not 50 characters long, but I just get the full name. It only goes out as far as it needs to go. Now, person also has some array elements in it, Ben, Amy, and Joe. And the limit to filter, when it's applied to an array as opposed to a string, limits the number of elements that are returned in your array. So here I'm displaying the person array, and I'm limiting it to 2, and I only get the first 2 elements. And again, just like with the string, when I limit it to 5, even though there's only 3 elements, I get all 3. It doesn't create 2 extra ones. Lastly, you can see here I just grabbed a specific element out of that array, and limit to once again treats that element as a string. So the third string, Joe, it just shows me the J. Angular includes some array filters, and that includes the limit to and the order by, but also the filter filter. Yes, that's right, we call it the filter filter. You can see it in action right here. So I've got on my controller a simple array called the person array, and each of the elements in that array has a name and an age. If I just drop filter :A, which means I want to filter anything with an A in it, you can see over here in my results that I get Amy, Tina, Gary, Frank, and Rachel. I get all the results that had an A in their elements. Ben and Joe, those guys are left off. They don't have an A on the list. Now, this is printing out the array. It's kind of an ugly way to look at it. So check out one of the cool things we can do here with our filters. I've got a span that repeats on each element of that array, and inside of my ng-repeat statement, I apply the filter to the P in person. That way, when I display p.name, I get a nice clean list. I get it looking the way I want it to look. Pretty cool, right? Now this found every element in my array that any of the properties had the letter A in them. What if I want to be more specific? Well, here I've filtered just to age 35. And all that's doing is showing me the one element where the age is equal to 35. So by putting in an object there, notice the curly braces on that filter statement, I can use my filter, I can apply my filter just to one property of the elements inside of my array. Lastly, I don't have to be dependent on Angular to compare my values. Here I've built a less than function, and all it does is take an actual and an expected, and if the actual is less than or equal to the expected value, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. Up here in my filter, I said age 35, and I referenced the less than function. And what that does is for every element in my array, it passes in the age as the actual value, and 35 as the expected value, and then I can perform my own custom comparison, return true if it should be included, and return false if it shouldn't. And you see here, it shows me every one where the age variable is less than or equal to 35. I've also got a quick example of the order by filter here on this page. And order by, just like filter, takes one parameter, and that is what element or what object do you want to order on. In this case, the first couple of examples, I indicate name, and you can see the first 2 printouts are ordered by name. The second one is reverse ordered because I put that little minus sign in front of the name on my order by filter. Now that used alphabetic filtering because name is a character string. If I wanted to sort numerically, I can pass in a numeric property, in this case age, and you can see on this third one that it sorted or it filtered those people by their age property.
The last couple of filters I'm not going to really get into details on. Date, like you might guess, just applies to date variables, and that allows you to format dates the way you'd like to, with spelled out months or 2-digit years, etc. And kind of conveniently, date also takes into locale settings, so it will take into account the client's definition of how dates should be printed out if you want it to. JSON allows you to print out JSON objects in JSON format if for whatever reason you need to do that on your page. If you'd like to know more about those two filters, it's all in the documentation. Now lastly, I want to demonstrate the fact that filters are not limited to expressions inside of your HTML template. You can also use filters, both built-in and custom filters, inside of your controllers, your modules, and your services back in the JavaScript. And all you need to do is some dependency injection with something called filter name-filter. And I'll show you how that works right now. Check it out, real simple fiddle here. And all we're doing is displaying the person.name variable. One is the person.name and the other is the person.uppername. And you can see here that in my function, I inject not only the scope, but something called uppercase filter. If I wanted it to be the lowercase filter, I'd use lowercase filter. If I wanted it to be the filter, I'd write filter. That's all you need to do is just prepend the filter you want on the word filter and pass it in to your scope. Then you can use it just like any other function, and it creates an uppercase version of the variable to display in your name. We'll finish this module by talking about custom filters. Custom filters are filters that you or I, as the web developer, can build and add onto our Angular application. Once we've built those custom filters, we can access them just like the built-in filters. We can use the bar syntax inside of our expressions in our HTML template, or we can use them inside of our controllers like we demonstrated here. Custom filters are the first step in expanding AngularJS to meet our needs as web developers. We're able to use these custom filters in the nice, clean, concise manner that the AngularJS syntax provides. Let's take a look. On this fiddle here, I've got my sample controller HTML template, and all that does is display the person.name variable a few different times. First, it just spits it right out, but then the rest of the times I use a filter called replace and pass it in some different variables. Now, we just went over the filters that are built into Angular, and guess what? There is no replace filter. That's because replace is one that I defined down here in my code. On the my app, the module variable, I called the filter function. And all the filter function does is register this replace filter inside of the module. So that's important to note. That's the scope of this filter is inside of this module. If I declare another ng-app on this page, it wouldn't have access to this filter. The module.filter function takes two parameters. First is the name of the filter that you want to create, in this case replace, and secondly is a function definition that simply returns a function. And that inside function that's being returned returns the value that we want to spit out. We've now registered this function, it's called a factory, inside of our myapp.filters. The definition of the internal function is pretty straightforward. We take three parameters, input, val, and uppercase. Now you're always going to take that first parameter no matter what, and that first parameter is always the value from the expression. So in our case, person.name. No matter if you have other parameters or not in your function, you're always going to want to take in that first parameter, call it whatever you like, I called it input, and that will be the value from the expression that's getting passed into your filter function. The other two parameters just come in the order that they're passed into the filter, so Amy and true go to val and uppercase. The function itself is pretty straightforward. I look at that val parameter, and if it's blank, then I change it to Ben. Otherwise, I spit out whatever's in that val parameter. Uppercase is simply a Boolean, and if it's true, then I change my value to uppercase. So you can see in my second instance, I said hello Ben because I didn't supply a value. In my third instance, it's hello Joe. And in my last instance, it's hello Amy, and Amy got turned to uppercase because I passed in the true parameter. So there you have it. A simple way to create your own custom filters that you can utilize right inside of the dynamic AngularJS HTML templates alongside of their expressions. An easy way to extend the capabilities of Angular to suit the particular needs of your application. So that concludes the nugget on expressions and filters. We covered a lot in this video, so let's take a second to go over it again. We began by talking about expressions in AngularJS, what they are, and specifically, expressions are Angular statements inside of your HTML templates that get interpreted by AngularJS. They're embedded right inside of your HTML document, but they don't print out on screen like that. They get executed by Angular
and interpreted, and the result is put out on screen. It's how you embed data binding right into your HTML document. Expressions also have the ability to have filters applied to them. Those are functions that you can apply to that expression after Angular is done interpreting it. And we talked a little bit about what some of those filters were and about what the different filters that Angular offers built into the library itself. We could filter arrays and order them. We could turn things to uppercase or lowercase. We could format currency and dates, that kind of stuff. Finally, we looked at how to build our own custom filters, our own custom extensions to the AngularJS library that we could utilize, that we could apply right inside of AngularJS expressions, so that we could apply our own functions, our own formatting to whatever values that we needed for our application. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this informative.